What did the US government know about the Palestinian Nakba as it was unfolding? And how did its leadership respond to the information at its disposal? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Josh Ruebner. Josh Ruebner is adjunct lecturer at Georgetown University's Justice and Peace Studies program and a former analyst in Middle East affairs at the Congressional Research Service, CRS. He is also the author of several books on the question of Palestine. Josh Ruebner, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections.
Thanks so much for having me on, Mouin.
I'd like to start by recounting US policy on the question of Palestine during the late 1940s. On 29 November 1947, Washington voted for United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine, and used its very considerable influence to encourage others to do the same. And then on the 15th of May, 1948, the administration of Harry Truman famously extended de facto recognition to the Israeli state a mere 11 minutes after it was proclaimed in Tel Aviv. But during the interim of these two dates, there were also considerable doubts within the US government about the wisdom of supporting the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And in the spring of 1948, there were growing indications the US might change course and instead recommend international trusteeship as an alternative to partition. Josh, what were the key objectives and motivations driving US policy during this fateful period?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And I think I'll start by backing up the story a little bit to February of 1948, when Great Britain decided that it would relinquish its mandate over Palestine and turn the matter over to the UN. The US played a very important role in terms of configuring how UNSCOP was composed, UNSCOP being the UN Special Commission.
Sorry, you meant February 46 or 47 rather than 48.
Excuse me, 47, correct, yes. In structuring UNSCOP, the UN Special Commission on Palestine, the US played a large role in determining the type of countries that would serve on this commission, and also instructing the commission on how and where they would go about their terms. But I think it's also important to recognize that the US played absolutely no role in the UNSCOP reporting and the deliberations. However, I want to point out something important, which is that Ralph Bunche, who was a US diplomat who was assigned to the UN Secretariat at the time, played a really seminal role in the UNSCOP recommendations to partition Palestine. He actually wrote both the majority plan that called for a partitioning of Palestine and the minority report that called for a federated state. And even though he wasn't a US official, he was very much in interaction with the United States at the time and subsequently. So I think before talking about the partition plan and how it was implemented or not implemented, it's also important to talk about the fact that really the majority plan that was proffered to the United States made no sense demographically, geographically, conceptually. So if you look at the original majority plan that the UN recommended for the partition of Palestine in 1947, basically what it said was that the Jewish state will be basically a binational state. There were an estimated 498,000 Jewish people living within the proposed boundaries of the Jewish state and 497,000 indigenous Palestinians. So parity right from the outset.
So Jewish state didn't really make much sense in a state where approximately only half of its prospective citizens would be Jewish.
That's right. And the reason why this was so was because UNSCOP could not draw the partition boundaries in any way that would result in a Jewish majority anywhere, because as we know, Jewish-owned land was not a majority in any of Palestine's districts.
Around 7% in total in 1947.
Right. And even in the most geographically concerted place of Jewish population around Tel Aviv, there still wasn't even a majority of Jewish-owned land in that district. So yes, there was no way to cut it up so that there could actually be homogenous Jewish state. And I think what was interesting, there was this Palestinian American analyst and activist at the time named Frank Sakran, who wrote a really contemporaneous account of the partition plan called The Palestine Dilemma. And this was published in early 1948. And he talked about the absurdity of erecting two antagonistic states, each consisting of three separate and alternating territories without continuous frontiers.
The third being the international zone centered around Jerusalem and Bethlehem.
Right. And in addition to that, each of the two proposed states was cut up into three pieces as well. And so what Sakran said was that the partition plan made the new map of Palestine resemble a crazy quilt or a jigsaw puzzle. So it didn't make sense demographically. It didn't make sense geographically. And it was also premised on the notion that Palestinian Jews and Palestinian Arabs could not live together under the same regime. Yet at the very same time, UNSCOP said that there should be an economic union between these two states that required the closest of coordination between them. And also, I want to add one more thing. The UNSCOP recommendation was not like the Peel Commission recommendation back in the 1930s. That had a recommendation for the forcible transfer and removal of Palestinians from within the proposed Jewish state. UNSCOP, to the contrary, said that Palestinian Arabs had to be guaranteed equal rights in the Jewish state. They could not be forcibly removed from their homes. And in fact, Israel would needed to have passed a constitution guaranteeing equal rights in order for the UN to ascertain that Israel had fulfilled the conditions of the partition before the state would be recognized.
And General Assembly Resolution 181, which was adopted that November, in fact, explicitly specified non-discrimination and equality of citizenship, and made absolutely no mention of population transfers, and therefore can be said to have prohibited them.
Absolutely. And so because you had these demographic and geographic and conceptual absurdities that were written into the UNSCOP partition plan, the US actually understood quite early on that the partition plan as proposed by UNSCOP was not workable and not feasible. And actually in the UN, in committee, the US made important changes to the majority plan to try to make it somewhat more advantageous to Palestinian Arabs. So for example, the US played a leading role in ensuring that Jaffa, which was a city of 70,000 Palestinian Arabs at the time, was taken out of the Jewish state and placed within as an enclave within the Arab state.
Creating even more of a kaleidoscopic map.
Exactly. So yeah, it's true that the US voted for this modified partition plan. And yes, it's very true that there was very, very significant congressional pressure put on different UN delegations to sway the votes that were needed to pass this resolution by a 2/3 vote. But I think it's important to note that the US did not support the partition plan out of any principled reason. And in fact, Secretary of State George Marshall repeatedly declared publicly the reason why the United States supported the idea of partition was simply because it was a majority recommendation of a UN committee, and that it was important to support the work of the UN and buttress its infant institutions, and to be seen as going against the majority recommendations of a UN committee would detract from the respectability of the order.
That was a position of Marshall. You had others in the administration, such as Truman's close advisor, Clark Clifford, who I think was very gung-ho about supporting the establishment of a Jewish state. Yet, as we were discussing, in the spring of 48, between the passage of the resolution in November 47 and Israel's proclamation of statehood in May 48, you began to get second thoughts at senior levels of the US administration, I think also particularly in the US military.
Absolutely. And even before that, even just 2 weeks after the US voted for the partition plan, the State Department had significant misgivings. They recognized that partition could not be implemented peacefully and could only be implemented forcefully. And the State Department wrote quite explicitly that forcibly partitioning partitioning the country against the wishes of the majority indigenous inhabitants of that country constituted a direct violation of the self-determination of the Palestinian people. So it was because of the intercommunal violence, and especially in the spring of 1948, as Zionist militias began to implement the ethnic cleansing campaign known as Plan Dalet or Plan D, that the U.S. really had second thoughts and grave.
And just to, for our viewers, Plan Dalet or Plan D was an operational plan adopted by the leadership of the Zionist movement in March of 1948 to conquer as much territory as possible beyond the boundaries proposed by the UN, and to effectively ethnically cleanse those areas that were thus conquered.
That's absolutely right. And because the US was witnessing this ethnic cleansing operation, that was a major factor that resulted in a major rethinking of US policy options. And the US did more than think about going back on partition. In March 1948, 2 months before Israel's establishment, the US actually proposed in the Security Council that an international trusteeship be appointed for Palestine instead of partition until some alternative resolution could be figured out. And even though the US couldn't get support in the UN for the trusteeship plan, they were still pushing it. And when they couldn't get support for that, they were pushing alternate schemes like establishing a truce and setting up a mediator, even the day before the establishment of Israel, all to try to forestall this impending catastrophe that they foresaw.
And why did they care?
Why did the US care? Well, I think the US primarily did not want to create a condition that would lead to instability that would be seen as furthering the opportunities for the Soviet Union's encroachment in the region. I think that this was the primary strategic understanding and motivation of the United States throughout this period, and it comes through very clearly in some of the strategic memorandum that were put together by Kennan and by Loy Henderson in the State Department, arguing that this was opening the doors to Russian advances in the region.
And the Soviet Union, of course, was a very strong supporter of Israeli statehood because it saw this as a measure that would get the British out of Palestine.
That's right. That's right. It was also taking place against a geostrategic battle between the United States and the Soviet Union in the region, which involved, Greece and Turkey and Iran. And this was all seen as potentially complicating the efforts to contain the Soviet Union amidst this growing Cold War.
Well, against this background, nevertheless, on the 15th of May, 1948, Israel proclaimed statehood, and only minutes later, President Truman extended de facto recognition. What were the motivations that caused all these other second thoughts and misgivings to effectively go out the window?
I think primarily it relates to the issue that we just talked about the fear of the Soviet Union stealing a beat on the United States and being the first country to recognize Israel. That was definitely a huge motivation for the Truman administration. But of course, there was tremendous domestic political pressure that was placed on the Truman administration as well, from Capitol Hill, from organized Zionist organizations. All this is part of the well-documented historiography.
I think Truman famously said that he has hundreds of thousands of Jewish voters, but no Arab voters. You do consider the domestic political factors significant next to the geopolitical ones we've been discussing?
I definitely do. I mean, it's definitely a well-established part of the historiography about this question and not contesting that. But I think there's another side to this story that's been largely suppressed. And I've been incredibly shocked by what I've turned up in the archives, understanding that these documents have been declassified for 40 years and barely touched by historians.
Well, let's turn to that. As you mentioned, the UN partition resolution allocated nearly 56% of mandatory Palestine to the prospective Jewish state. Yet in 1949, at the end of the Palestine War, the first Arab-Israeli war, the state of Israel was in control of no less than 78% of the country. Israel and its advocates have claimed that this territorial discrepancy is a result of war and conflict rather than intent on the part of Israel, while Palestinians have insisted that maximum territorial conquest was a primary Zionist and later Israeli war aim. So based on your research in these archives, what conclusions did US diplomats and policymakers at the time reach with respect to this issue?
So you had US diplomats stationed in Jerusalem and in Haifa before the establishment of Israel. And of course, later in 1948, you had the establishment of a US embassy in Tel Aviv. So you also had diplomats reporting from there. It's very clear from the archives that the United States and its diplomats understood in quite a lot of detail about the ethnic cleansing operations that were underway by Israel. You have lots of reports about Israel's intent and desire to expand beyond the borders allotted to it under the partition plan. You have many reports about the destruction of Palestinian villages, many reports about the looting and expropriation of Palestinian property that was taking place on such a wide scale. And in addition, very detailed reporting on the expanding Palestinian refugee crisis, which was reported in great and heartbreaking detail by U.S. diplomats. But I think
that will get to in a minute. But I'd now like to focus specifically on territorial expansion, because you have two competing narratives. One saying, the Zionist movement, unlike the Palestinians in the Arab states, accepted the partition resolution, was satisfied with the boundaries allocated by the UN, and it was only because the Arabs went to war that the map ended up looking like it did. Whereas the Arabs and the Palestinians have countered that, in fact, they took arms to prevent Israel from occupying and cleansing even more territory. And what was the U.S. assessment on this critical issue?
The U.S. clearly understood that the Haganah and other Zionist militias were on the offensive and had the capacity and capabilities to conquer all of Palestine. And there's a very eye-opening cable from May 13th, just one day before the end of the British mandate, from Thomas Wasson, who was the U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem, who was assassinated later that year. He wrote, "Speculation is rife as to whether their newfound strength may not encourage Jews to attempt more territory." And he cited Jewish agency spokesperson as saying, quote, "Ben-Gurion, the future prime minister of the state of Israel, had always said that the main aim of Jews was to get all of Palestine." And I think it's also important to note that the U.S. opposed the idea of Israel expanding beyond the borders that were allotted to it under the partition plan. This was something known as the Jessup principle, named after Philip Jessup, who was one of the most important players within the U.S. delegation to the UN. The Jessup principle was that if Israel insisted on maintaining its conquests and its territorial expansionism, that it would have to compensate for lands that were allotted to it under the partition plan. In other words,
land swap, in other words.
A land swap, exactly. And that Israel should not be allowed to keep its conquests while maintaining control of all of the land that it was allocated under the partition plan.
So there's a clear assessment by diplomats on the ground, by American officials in New York at the United Nations. Did these views percolate up to the decision makers in Washington, D.C.? And if so, did they try to put any of these views into effect?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the mythologies of the historiography around U.S. policy during the Truman administration, that there was some kind of divide between the State Department and the White House, and that the State Department was trying to undercut the president. And honestly, I think this is nonsense historiography. There is very close coordination between the State Department and President Truman. President Truman signed off on everything that the State Department did. The idea to abandon partition was something that had Truman's full concurrence. He literally signed the memo authorizing it. What took people by surprise was actually Truman's recognition of Israel, which the State Department was not informed about before, and the US delegation to the UN was not informed. So if anything, it was the reverse, that Truman was undercutting the State Department. But in general, there was tremendous agreement amongst the highest levels of US government about the fundamentals of US policy, even though they were confused and going through reversals.
And again, it perhaps bears a recollection that this was also the era of the so-called Truman Doctrine, whose strategic objective was to keep the Soviet Union and local communists out of government in the states on the Middle East periphery, in Turkey and Greece and Iran, and so forth. And my next question, Josh, is more than anything else, the Nakba is defined by the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, the dispossession and expulsion of some 80% of the Palestinian population by Zionist militias and the Israeli military between November 1947 and the early 1950s. As you all know, Israel and its apologists have consistently maintained that there was no planned expulsion, and that the Nakba was, in the words of Israeli historian Benny Morris, born of war, not design. Based on your research, what did US diplomats conclude about three issues? What did they conclude about the nature of the Palestinian exodus, the motives behind the systematic looting and destruction of Palestinian property, and third, the treatment of Palestinians who were not expelled and came to live under Israeli rule? I realize it's a three-part question, but perhaps we can start with US knowledge or assessments of the nature of the Palestinian exodus.
The US assessment of the exodus and expulsion of the Palestinian people from Palestine was very accurate. You had contemporaneous reports coming in from Haifa, from Jerusalem, even from the embassy in Tel Aviv, presenting this as a mixture of factors amidst the chaos of war, that some Palestinians chose to voluntarily leave their homes in advance of advancing militias and armies, as people do under war conditions.
War refugees, in other words.
Exactly. You had reports from US diplomats of many Palestinians being pushed from their homes under active military assault by Zionist militias and later the Israeli military. And you also have quite extensive documentation by US diplomats about Israel's deliberate expulsion and demolition of Palestinian villages on a vast scale. All of that is very known. And I think the important thing to note here is that the US diplomats understood this to be a deliberate plan. They understood it as a deliberate plan by Israel to remove as many Palestinians as possible from their homes and their lands, and to take steps that would make it impossible for Palestinian refugees to return home. So,
in other words, they didn't see this as kind of the crazy machinations of some zealous local commander, but they saw this as organized military units implementing a plan that was put to them by their political leadership.
I would say that that's true. Now, it's important to note that US diplomats did not have this all-pervasive knowledge of what was taking place at the time, because they were largely pinned down in the consulates in Jerusalem and Haifa and couldn't really—
Because of the warfare.
Exactly. But they were getting detailed reports from other consuls. They were getting detailed reports from the UN Truce Supervisory Organization, later in 1948 when that was established. But it's very clear that the US diplomats understood that the destruction of Palestinian villages, the looting of Palestinian property was a deliberate policy. Here's something that US Consul General John McDonald in Jerusalem wrote on July 27th of 1948. He wrote that there was, quote, no respect or protection for Arab interests and property. Every Arab house and shop has been thoroughly looted, and even windows, window frames, doors, plumbing, electric fixtures, and installations were removed. And he understood that this was being done to create conditions where Palestinian refugees would have nothing to return to. He said, quote, "There is little, if any, possibility of Arabs returning to their homes in Israel or Jewish-occupied Palestine," which was the term the U.S. used for Israel's conquering of additional land beyond the partition boundaries that were drawn.
And how about the treatment of Palestinians who remained within the new Israeli state?
I was incredibly surprised to find very, very detailed reporting on the pervasive discrimination and oppression that Palestinians faced under Israeli rule. There are very detailed reports coming in from cities like Haifa and Akka, for example, about how Israel forcibly removed Palestinians from their homes after the fighting had ended in those cities and concentrated them in specific areas. So in Haifa, for example, Palestinian Muslims and Palestinian Christians were separated by Israel by their religion and placed in different neighborhoods within Haifa and concentrated there. In Akka, for example, all Palestinians who lived outside the walls of the old city and who tended to be a very prosperous community were looted thoroughly and forced to be removed into the old city of Akka itself and basically kept under prison-like conditions there. So you have lots of these type of reports in the US archives. And I think it's also very important to note that the US diplomats at the time understood quite clearly that the Nakba was an ongoing process, just as we talk about today, because there are very detailed reports in the archives, for example, of continued mass Israeli expulsions of Palestinians in 1949, in 1950, well after armistice accords have been signed, well after there's any active fighting between Israel and Arab armies. I found, for example, in the archives of the US consulate in Haifa, very, very detailed lists with names and ages and professions of every single Palestinian who was expelled from Tarshiha in the north of the country by Israel in 1949. You have very detailed, almost weekly reports coming into the State Department from the UN Truth Supervisory Organization, which, by the way, was led by an American, documenting the weekly and monthly rates and numbers of expulsions of Palestinians from Majdal in the south in 1950 even, where thousands of Palestinians were expelled from their homes.
And these were expelled to the Gaza Strip at the time.
They were expelled to the Gaza Strip. They were nominally citizens of the state of Israel. And, you know, there are many, many, many reports like this to show that those who were able to remain, those who resisted the Nakba, were not necessarily safe, and that they were subjected to continued ill treatment, discrimination at best, and expulsion at the worst.
And it's perhaps worth pointing out here that United Nations General Assembly Resolution 181, which we were discussing earlier, also included an explicit prohibition on the seizure of property or alienation of land belonging to Arabs in the prospective Jewish state or to Jews in the prospective Arab state. But my question is, so you are talking about this very detailed information that was compiled by diplomats on the ground, perhaps not very senior officials and so on. And obviously their reports were sent to the State Department in Washington and presumably in one way or another found their way also to officials in the White House. So my question to you is, how did the US government and its decision makers respond to the information available to them? And why did they respond in the way that they did?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question. And I think to answer that, I'll focus on how US policymakers in Washington, D.C. responded to diplomatic reports about the Palestinian refugee crisis.
Yeah.
I think this is incredibly important. In the summer of 1948, when you started to have ceasefires that were put into place, U.S. diplomats were able to start venturing out of the US.
These were ceasefires between Israel, the Israeli military on the one hand, and Arab armies, for example, the Jordanian army in the West Bank or the Egyptian army in southern Palestine and elsewhere.
Correct, yes, imposed by the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
So under these conditions, US diplomats were able to venture out, and they went regularly to Ramallah, for example, where a lot of Palestinian refugees from the central portion of Palestine were expelled to. And they actually set up temporary offices in the Ramallah Friends School to document the Palestinian refugee crisis. And the Ramallah Friends School, of course, is a US institution that's existed since the 19th century. And US diplomats and other Americans who worked at the Ramallah Friends School sent back these incredibly detailed and heartrending reports about the very, very dire condition of Palestinian refugees in that area, many of whom were living out in the open with no access to shelter, with no access to food, with no access to clean drinking water, with no access to any medical attention whatsoever. And so this really triggered alarm bells in Washington, D.C. And to its credit, the State Department actually did take a very prominent role in leading a coordinated civil society response from U.S. humanitarian organizations.
Such as the Quakers at the time.
Such as the Quakers. That was one of maybe about a dozen U.S. organizations that provided emergency aid. Also, the American Red Cross was there as well. But this also went to the political level. So the U.S. played a very prominent role in pushing for the establishment of what was known as UNRPR, UN Relief for Palestine Refugees, which was a short-term, strictly humanitarian operation to provide—
The forerunner of UNRWA.
The forerunner of UNRWA, yes. Just designed to provide this immediate humanitarian need for these Palestinian refugees, because as we talked about, there wasn't supposed to be a refugee crisis resulting from a partition plan. So what the US did was it took its ambassador to Egypt, Stanton Griffiths at the time, and they allowed Griffiths to serve as the head of UNRPR. And he organized a really remarkable effort. And there were warnings from the very pro-Israel US ambassador to Tel Aviv, James McDonald, that if the UN and the US didn't do something quickly, more than 100,000 refugees were at the risk of dying over the winter.
From disease and starvation.
Disease and starvation and not having shelter. Yeah. And 1948 was a very harsh and brutal winter too, in Palestine, which compounded the problems. So, were it not for this emergency mobilization undertaken by US leadership, there could have been an even huger catastrophe with hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees dying. It's also important to note, again, with the refugee issue, US diplomats on the ground, the implementing agencies who are providing this humanitarian aid, were also reporting back politically. They were talking about how they were watching Israel burn Palestinian villages and dynamite Palestinian villages. And these were done in villages that were just across the ceasefire lines with Gaza, so that many Palestinian refugees could actually see with their own eyes Israel destroying their villages just a few kilometers away. All of this was reported back in great detail. So you have this humanitarian side, but you also have a much more explicitly political side that people often forget about today. And that is that the US helped with the introduction and the passage of UN General Assembly Resolution 194.
And that takes me to my next question, which, as you mentioned, it's often forgotten that the US government, under the same presidency that recognized Israel, no less, was once an advocate of the Palestinian right of return. And additionally, as you've mentioned, opposed Israel's conquest and annexation of territories beyond the proposed partition boundaries. Give us an indication of how the United States government attempted to promote this policy agenda. And secondly, Washington, as you know, eventually began to acquiesce in Israel's ethnic cleansing and territorial expansionism. And I'd also like to ask you about when did these changes begin to take place and for what reason?
Yeah. Certainly, the most critical vehicle for the United States pushing for Palestinian refugee rights was through UN General Assembly Resolution 194. And also in the archives of the State Department, you find actually very, very explicit numbers that the State Department put together. Basically, the State Department was demanding that Israel repatriate at the very least, 250,000 Palestinian refugees.
Out of approximately 750,000.
Approximately that number at that time, yes. The idea being that there were originally supposed to be 400,000 Palestinians within the borders of the Jewish state under the partition plan. So basically what the State Department was doing was saying there are currently 150,000 Palestinians within Israeli-controlled territories. You must repatriate at least 250,000 to those territories to basically bring back the status quo ante before the ethnic cleansing. So this was done on the political level. And
without effect.
Without effect. But the US tried for the better part of 1949 to actually actualize the Palestinian refugee right of return. The US was one of 3 countries that served on the Palestine Conciliation Commission, which was designed
Turkey and France.
Exactly. And that was designed to resolve all the outstanding issues that arose from the Nakba.
Do we have evidence of the US going beyond making appeals and demands and actually, for example, issuing threats against Israel on this issue, or making clear that there would be a price to pay if Israel continued to neglect US policy on this issue?
This is where things start to change, and this is where US policy begins to fall into a very predictable pattern that we see even today. So the US issues policy declarations that we demand XYZ, but is not necessarily willing to put any political capital behind it to effectuate those outcomes. So I found in the archives this memo written in the summer of 1949. This was after the first round of the Lausanne negotiations through the PCC, after the US had begun to grow frustrated about Israel's intransigence in these negotiations which were taking place. And so the State Department put together a memorandum outlining
these were the armistice negotiations.
These were post-armistice. Mm-hmm. This was a multilateral set of negotiations between Israel and all Arab states, right, with the partition of Palestinian refugee organizations. Mm-hmm. And it was designed to resolve territorial issues, to establish the Corpus Separatum, the international enclave for Jerusalem, and to effectuate Palestinian refugees' right of return. So because Israel's being so intransigent at Lausanne, President Truman actually says he's, quote, rather disgusted by Israel's treatment of the Palestinian refugee question. So they prepare this list of potential sanctions against Israel. And they actually implement one, which was holding up the delivery of export-import bank loans to Israel, which were vitally needed by Israel at the time, because what Israel was doing with those loans was resettling new Jewish immigrants to Israel on stolen Palestinian property. Israel desperately needed this money to accomplish this, and the US held it up for a certain amount of time, but capitulated under political pressure so that the loans started to flow again. Mm-hmm. So it's really at this point in the summer of 1949 where the US makes a clear decision that it's not actually going to take the decisions that are necessary and expend the political capital that's necessary to actually force Israel to repatriate Palestinian refugees. And there's an explicit moment in August 1949 when US diplomats say quite clearly that the political track on these negotiations have failed. We're at a standstill. And instead of pursuing a political resolution to this question, we're going to look at the economic side and see if there's something we can do in terms of regional economic development that will somehow lead to the resettlement of Palestinian refugees instead. This is what's known as the CLAP mission, mm-hmm, which became the forerunner of UNRWA. Basically, its recommendations formed UNRWA.
And I think CLAP had been involved with the Tennessee Valley Authority during the Great Depression and had then proposed a similar development scheme for Palestinian refugees in the Arab world.
That's right. But to be fair to Clapp, he also understood that this was not only an economic issue, that political rights were involved, and that economic rights could not, or economic development could not take the place of political rights, even though that's what his recommendations are most known for today, I remember.
So you said that what the developments you just described kind of set a precedent for what we've been witnessing in the intervening decades. And that brings me to my next question. And I'd like to discuss basically the contemporary relevance of the discussion we've been having today and how it is reflected in US policy towards Israel and the Palestinians today. And perhaps we could here take two examples and others if you'd like, but the two that immediately come to mind to me are, first of all, now the ongoing Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, and secondly, the first ever commemoration of the Nakba that was held yesterday in the United States Congress after the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, tried to censor it.
Yeah, absolutely. There is this pattern that began in the Truman administration. And the first book I wrote was on the Obama administration's policy toward Israeli-Palestinian issues. And it was the same exact pattern where President Obama would make these grandiose statements about the rights that Palestinians were entitled to. He said very clearly at the outset of his administration that Israel had to freeze all forms of colonization in the West Bank in order to restart negotiations, and then basically just capitulated to political pressure and didn't want to expend any of the tremendous political capital that he enjoyed at the outset of the administration to actually make his articulated policy goals a reality. So in many respects, the pattern set by Truman has persisted to this day. And you see the same thing definitely with the Biden administration. You see the Biden administration talking about equal rights and equal security and equal dignity for the Palestinian people. But what has the Biden administration done to actually move that forward? Nothing. It's continued to provide Israel with the diplomatic and military support that it needs to continue the ongoing Nakba. So these are patterns that were set very early on by the Truman administration, and I think definitely persist to this day. And I'm glad that you mentioned the event that took place in the Senate to commemorate 75 years of the ongoing Nakba. To his great shame and disgrace, the Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy, canceled an educational event that was scheduled to be put together by 9 different Palestine rights organizations. He just enacted exactly what Israel tries to enact against the Palestinian people, which is the complete erasure of the Palestinian people and the erasure of the Palestinian narrative. This is literally what he was trying to do in Congress.
And just to be clear, this was an event that was formally hosted by a number of congressional representatives.
It was formally hosted by a number of outside organizations with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib as the special guest. Mm-hmm. And she also introduced in Congress this week a historic resolution, not only commemorating the Nakba, but recognizing the ongoing nature of the Nakba, and talking about how the extremist Israeli government in power now is calling for a second Nakba and is calling to erase and wipe out Palestinian villages from the map in ways that are eerily similar to what Ben-Gurion was talking about in 1948 and actually doing at the time. So the fact that you had a congressional resolution introduced about these issues and having an educational event in the Capitol with survivors of the Nakba who testified to the atrocities that they lived through, I think was a very, very powerful and meaningful moment. And even though Speaker McCarthy succeeded in driving the event out of the Capitol, we still held it in the Senate.
So it was meant to be in the House of Representatives, and as a result of his actions, was convened in the Senate. Is that correct?
Technically, it was going to be in the Congressional Visitor Center, which is part of the Capitol. But yes, it had to be moved over to the Senate.
And how did it end up being hosted in the Senate?
Thanks to Senator Bernie Sanders, who allowed the use of his committee room to host the event.
I see. Josh, my final question is, as you know, yesterday marked a year to the day since Israel's summary execution of the iconic Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank's Jenin refugee camp. As is well known, she was also a US citizen. How has the US government and the US political class more broadly responded to this killing of a prominent US citizen by a former state? And how does this response compare to the US reaction to similar violations perpetrated against other US citizens abroad?
Yeah, the Biden administration has really done its best and its utmost to try to evade the issue of holding Israel accountable for its extrajudicial assassination of Shireen Abu Akleh. And I think if it weren't for the really dogged and fierce advocacy that members of her family have put forward over the past year, I don't think we would have gotten to this place. They've mobilized extremely effectively to get dozens of members of Congress to demand that the United States hold Israel accountable for this atrocity. And while there is reportedly a criminal investigation underway currently by the FBI, at the same time, the Biden administration has failed to answer even very basic, factual, informational requests from senior senators and other members of Congress about this killing and about what the United States knows.
So, and there's also, I believe, a report that has been drafted by the United States Security Coordinator in Jerusalem, which Secretary of State Blinken is refusing to release to Congress. Is that correct?
It's really unclear what's going on in that regard. There was a report by the US Security Coordinator many months ago, that absolved Israel of any intentionality in killing Shireen, which was ridiculous because they interviewed none of the eyewitnesses. They did not interview the soldier who pulled the trigger on the gun. There may or may not be a new report. That's not even clear. Senator Chris Van Hollen has demanded information about this from the Biden administration as to whether there is this second report or not. And even he can't get answers out of the Biden administration. So even in the very, very unlikely scenario that the FBI files a criminal indictment against the Israeli soldier who killed Shireen, the Biden administration is still doing nothing to implement US law when it comes to this extrajudicial assassination. Because under US law, the Leahy law, a unit of a military that engages in a gross violation of human rights like this killing needs to be sanctioned under US law. All military aid to that unit needs to be cut off under US law.
And that's irrespective of the citizenship of the victims. But I'd also like to ask you, how does the US response to the killing of this US citizen compare to its reaction to similar cases of other US citizens being killed or otherwise abused by less coddled states?
Yeah, let's compare Shireen's case to the case of the horrific killing of journalist Daniel Pearl in Pakistan in 2002. What did the United States do after Pearl was murdered? They put up $5 million in reward money for the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in Pearl's execution. When the person who was held guilty for Pearl's murder was released from Pakistani jail in 2021, the Biden administration vehemently protested this person going free. And it's currently reviewing its options in terms of extraditing this person to the United States, because this person has already been indicted all the way back during the Bush administration. So you see the United States government willing to put up millions of dollars to secure the arrest and conviction of someone who killed a US journalist in one case, but won't even apply basic US laws in the case of Shireen. And
or acknowledge that a murder was committed.
Yes, and these are like apples and oranges, because it wasn't a state actor that murdered Daniel Pearl. It was a terrorist organization. But in this case, you have a government and a military that's armed and financed with $4 billion in weapons every year by the United States that murdered Shireen. And it's very, very probable that the gun and the ammunition and the boots and the Jeep and everything that was used in this operation to assassinate Shireen Abu Akleh were paid for by US taxpayers. So you have this absurd and obscene situation where a US citizen doing her job as a journalist is killed in cold blood by a military that gets $4 billion of weapons every year from the United States, and yet still the level of willingness to absolve Israel of any accountability is as strong as ever with the Biden administration.
Josh Ruebner, on that note, I'd like to thank you for sharing your expertise and research and insights with Connections. It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mouin.